In this movie, we're going to have a look at material options and how they affect lighting. So, adjusting lighting settings for the lights themselves will affect how a light affects a layer. But as well as the light settings, material options for the layers themselves will determine how they accept the light. If you want to follow along, you can open up the Material Options AEP, which you can find in the Introduction to 3D folder. Now here we have our little comp where we have our characters on top of these cogwheels, and we have some quite intricate lighting set up. And when we were adjusting the lights, we noticed how difficult it is to see the lighting effects in fast draft. Same with material options. You really want to be able to work in full resolution, or at least adaptive resolution, in order to see the effects of the lights properly. You'll notice that the lights aren't anti-aliased, so it's hard to see things like soft shadows. If I put adaptive resolution on, it shouldn't take too long to render that, and we can see that we get a much better quality rendering of our shadows and also of our material options. Now I'm working on a system that has a supported NVIDIA graphics card. If you want to find out whether your system has a supported card, you can check the Adobe website for details. And you'll notice that it's very quick to render using a supported graphics card. Now, I'm on a Mac with an ATI card normally, and with that, I would have difficulty working in adaptive resolution, let alone full quality. So it's worthwhile considering either upgrading to a new card or a new machine with a supported graphics card if you're going to be doing a lot of 3D. And this is adaptive resolution, so you can see it's still not perfect. If we go up to full high quality, which is final quality, again, on this machine, it shouldn't take too long to update, and you should see an improvement of quality, even higher quality. And if you go up to full resolution, that will look its absolute best. But for now, I'm not going to wait for that to update. We're just going to go to adaptive resolution and work in there. So let's have a look at how these layers react to light. You'll notice that the floor layer is picking up light, but it's not really picking up any reflections. It's not reflective, whereas the cogs are. If I open up the cog settings, so I'm opening up the material options by double hitting the A key, and that opens up the geometry options, but also the material options. And you'll see that I've actually adjusted the reflection intensity on those. If I put that all the way up to 100, you'll notice it becomes extremely reflective. It darkens it down and makes it very, very reflective. I didn't want it that reflective, so I've put 50% reflection intensity. And when you have reflection intensity on, let's put that to 50 again, so change it back to 50. When you have reflection intensity on, you'll see that as well as accepting shadows, it accepts reflections of layers that have their reflection appearance switched on. So notice that this is switched off for the cog to appear in reflections, but if I select my characters, so if I select one of them, double hit the A key, you'll see in there I have appear in reflections switched on. So certain characters I want to appear in reflections, certain characters I don't. For example, the background I've got switched off. If I go into my material options for that and say appears in reflections, you'll notice now that the patterns from the background, if we just preview that, will appear in the reflections as well. You're starting to see a bit of colour from the background appearing in the reflective material. And you can see clearly that girl's leg being reflected in the cogs. So the cogs are quite shiny and reflective. What else makes them shiny? Well, some of the other settings that I've changed, and if you want to figure out what's been changed to get that reflective setting, select the cog and just go to Animation, Reveal Modified Properties. And you'll see that the other material options I've adjusted are specular intensity and specular shininess. And that gives us a much more shiny look to our cogs. We can also adjust the ambient and diffuse light to determine how much light is accepted, how dark or how light the cogs appear. And we've also adjusted the metal setting. If you reset properties, you can see whether I've reduced them or increased them. So that one I'd actually reduced down to 80%. Now I tend to do this by trial and error. I tend to just move through these properties and adjust them to taste and figure out what I want that way. If you're more scientific in your approach, you can also work that way too. And you can also adjust the reflection intensity, as I said. So if I want to make that more or less reflective, I would increase that. And I can also increase or decrease the sharpness of the reflection. So what about if I wanted to make the floor reflective, for example? What would I do? Well, I'd go into my material options. I'd make sure it accepts lights and shadows and appears in reflections. No, I don't want it to, so I'll switch that off. Whoops, I've got the wrong layer. Let's just select the floor layer. Okay, so yes, I would say I don't really want it to appear in reflections. Now, when I click on that initially, it changes so that it only appears in reflections, and you can see the reflections from the floor onto the edge of the cog. If I switch that again, it switches it off, so no colour from the floor reflects on the cog. If I switch it again, it switches it on, so we get a little bit of blue colour reflecting onto that. And I actually quite like that, so I'm going to leave it. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to move down here and we're going to put our reflection intensity up to 100. And this is where you'll really see the power of the reflections. Okay, a little bit too much for me, so let's go to 50%. And we've got a little bit of reflectivity now on the floor, so we've got a nice shiny floor. I'm going to bring the sharpness down to about 30%, and that gives us a much softer look. So we can go down maybe a little bit higher, maybe 40 or 50%, so we're getting a little bit more detail. And already just with that, it starts to make our floor look more shiny. But we can also increase the specular intensity, and that's going to increase these little highlights on the floor, which by having like intense highlights like that, it makes it look more shiny. And I can adjust the shininess setting as well, put that up or down. Putting it up will create darker areas and more contrast between dark and light. Now you'll notice if we have a look at this on 3rd resolution with the standard ray trace settings, it looks okay but not great. So what I want to do is show you a couple of tips on how to get this rendering with less noise. At the moment it has quite a lot of noise. So let's just make this full screen. And I'm doing that by hitting the tilde key. And I've gone to half resolution, which should be enough for us to see. And what we're going to do is go down here and go from adaptive resolution to final quality. And with the standard settings, you're still going to get a little bit of noise in the reflections and any areas where you've got motion blur or depth of field, for example. So what you really want to do if you want to get the highest quality is click on Ray Trace 3D and go into the options, and the default ray tracing quality is 3. I find that if you put that up to a value of about 8 and change the anti-aliasing filter to cubic, that you tend to get better results. Now that will take longer to render. You can see there my mouse is reflecting the fact that After Effects is having to think a little bit about that. But already you can see that we've got much smoother results. And actually on this machine with the supported graphics card, it doesn't take too long to render, probably about 2 or 3 seconds per frame. A lot better than on my poor old Mac. Now obviously at full resolution it would take a little bit longer, but you can see that considering the quality of the lighting and the reflectivity, it's pretty fast. I mean, that's going to render a couple of seconds within a minute or so. So that's a little bit about how you can use some of the new settings in the material options, like reflection intensity and sharpness. There's also reflection roll-off as well, if you want the reflections to roll off after a certain amount of time instead of be constant. You can adjust that setting there. So have a play with those new settings. If you want more of a description of what these settings do, then and more of a technical description of what they do, you can check out the online help for some more details. So let's just play a little bit of that so we can see how it looks. Okay, so really nice to be able to incorporate some real 3D elements in the scene.